Hello. For this assignment, I chose Shakespeare in the Bush by Laura Bohannan. I actually really enjoyed reading this article because it didn't turn out the way that I had initially thought, which is kind of funny because that's kind of the theme of the article. I had thought going in this was going to be a Shakespeare story. Um, it is a Shakespeare story, but it turned out a lot differently in the end than I initially thought it would, which is really funny because that's kind of the whole uh, article's main point wrapped up into a nutshell. The article starts with Bohannan leaving England to do research with the Tiv people in West Africa. Before she leaves, one of her friends tells her that Americans often misunderstand Shakespeare because he's very English. Bohannan disagrees and says while customs might be different, human nature is basically the same everywhere. She believes that a story like Hamlet has one universal meaning that everyone will understand. While she's living with the Tiv people, the elders ask her to tell one of the stories from her own country. She decides to tell them Hamlet by Shakespeare because she is convinced that they'll understand it the same way she does. But that did not happen at all. Almost immediately, the elders began stopping and interrupting her at every major part of the story. When Hamlet's father's ghost appears, they tell her that dead people don't come back. They believe it must have been an omen or something caused by witchcraft. Later, when Hamlet is upset with his uncle that married his mother, the elders don't understand because that's not a problem in their culture. And actually, a man marrying his brother's widow is actually the responsible thing to do. Throughout the entire story, they continue to reinterpret events using their own beliefs and traditions instead of Bohannan's. By the end of the story, Hamlet, the elders are convinced that they've figured out what Shakespeare really meant. They even tell Bohannan that when she goes home, she should ask her own elders because they clearly never explained the story correctly to her. I thought the ending was actually really funny because Bohannan started the story thinking that she was the expert, and then it turned out that she found out at the end that that everybody can interpret a story a different way. Kind of like how I thought going into this article that I could interpret it one way, but then it turns out something completely different. I think the article does a great job of showing how worldview shapes the way we think or interpret things. Bohannan believed Hamlet had one obvious meaning because that's how she had always been taught to read it. The Tiv elders believed their interpretation was correct because it fit everything they knew about family leadership, marriage, respect, and the supernatural. Neither group was making random guesses. Their own understanding came from their culture that they had grown up in. One example of ethnocentrism is Bohannan's assumption that her interpretation of Hamlet was the only correct one. She wasn't trying to be disrespectful, but she believed that if she had explained the story well enough, the Tiv elders would eventually agree with her. Instead, they challenged almost every major event in the story. Their worldview was very different that the meaning had been completely changed by the end. Bohannan realizes that she isn't the only one making assumptions. I think that's something that a lot of us can relate to. It's because it's really easy to think our way of seeing the world is just common sense. The story had also challenged me to think about how we assume our own culture. Before reading this article, I probably would have said that if two people read the same story, they'd come away with basically the same message. The article proved that that's not always true. Even though that's been studied for hundreds of years, it can be understood completely differently completely depending on someone's culture. It reminded me that being different doesn't automatically mean being wrong. One tradition of my own culture that I celebrate, is Christmas. In my family, Christmas time, we all sit around and we exchange gifts and we take turns opening our presents one by one. And we usually thank the person that gave us the gift and talk about how much we like it in front of everybody. To me, that's completely normal. It's how I've celebrated Christmas my entire life. but for someone else in another culture, that can be seen very differently. They might think we're putting too much attention on material gifts or on an individual's recognition instead of focusing on the group. Just like the Tiv elders viewed Hamlet through their own worldview, someone else could view one of my traditions very differently from theirs. One of the biggest lessons that I have learned from this article is that good communication starts with listening before judging. If Bohannan had just started by asking the Tiv people how they understood family relations or spiritual beliefs before telling a story, she probably would have expected a very different interpretation. Instead of assuming people see the world seeing the same world that we do, we should probably ask questions and understand where they're coming from first. This also reminds me that of volunteering with organizations that serve experiencing homelessness. I have been volunteering for a homeless shelter, and when I first started, I had expected everyone to act completely the same way, and graceful and thankful and grateful of our volunteer time that we're putting in towards them. But I quickly realized that that's not how everybody reacts to volunteers. A lot of these people are dealing with mental health and trauma, and they're not comfortable opening up to strangers like myself. This experience reminds me of this article and Bohannan because of our first impressions aren't always the correct one. Once I understood people's experience better, I realized my own assumptions assumptions can change. I've also started a new job. I just completed my first week, and one lesson that I thought that was really important going in is understanding everybody around me, because everybody, just like we have explained in this article to us, that our interpretation of things isn't how everybody else can interpret stuff from their worldview, experiences, etc. If I automatically assume that everybody around me thinks the way I do, I probably wouldn't be a very good leader or communicator. Overall, the biggest lesson I took away from this article is that worldviews influence almost everything we do. It shapes how we communicate, how we understand stories, and even how we judge other people's actions. Shakespeare in the Bush reminded me that understanding another person's perspective doesn't mean I have to agree with it. It simply means I'm willing to learn before I judge. I think that's one of the most important skills anyone can have when working with different people from different cultures. Thank you.